again and welcome back to our next lesson, journeying through the major arcana of the tarot. In this lesson we're going to be dealing with card number 10, the Wheel of Fortune, and card number 11, Justice. So let's have a look at the wheel first, and I'm going to go straight into the Waite-Smith image. There's actually quite a lot of complicated symbolism in here. So we're going to start with this modern image, do some comparisons with a couple of other 20th century decks, and then work our way backwards to some of the older images where you'll see some quite significant differences. So what have we got here? What we actually have is a depiction of the throne of God. You can see in the four corners of this card you have the four winged creatures that are actually drawn from the biblical book of Ezekiel. These traditionally surround the throne of God. So we have top left a winged man, top right an eagle, bottom right a winged lion, and bottom left a winged bull. So the four faces of God, also the four elements, the four directions. So in their centre is the Wheel of Fortune itself. Now the wheel is filled with a combination of alchemical symbols, Hebrew letters, and also a four-lettered anagram, which we'll come to in a minute. So what about the alchemical symbols first? Think of alchemy as representing magical and elemental transformations. So in effect, change, mutation, evolution. So the fact that this wheel is presented almost as a magic talisman containing these alchemical symbols shows that it is in itself a wheel of change. As the wheel turns, so the universe changes, evolves, transmutes. Okay? So what about the Hebrew letters? We have four Hebrew letters here. These are, in Hebrew, the unspeakable name of God. They're all consonants, so there are no vowels in this. So the name was meant to be unpronounceable, in a way to symbolise how God himself can't be fully named. That name can't be spoken. So the presence of God's name on the rim of the wheel again reinforces that the wheel is on the divine throne. The wheel of change is divinely inspired and divinely ordained change. And the very action of God himself or herself within the universe is change itself. Everything is fresh, everything is new. Nothing is ever the same two times over. Okay? So what about the anagram? Four letters. So the four letters we have are T, A, R and O. So going clockwise from the top, that spells a variation of tarot. So this is the wheel of the tarot, the wheel of change. But then the combinations of those letters say so many other things as well. Let's have a look at a couple of those other combinations. T-O-R-A, Torah. In Hebrew tradition, the word of God. So again, as the wheel turns, the divine word is emanating from there. And that takes us back to the whole concept of divine change again, the divine law. R-O-T-A, rota, Latin for wheel. Now, one of the other more interesting ones, if you go from 3 o'clock and if you go anti-clockwise, you have A-T-O-R, Ator, or that's a variation of the Egyptian goddess Hathor. Now, she is the goddess of the dead and by default the goddess of eternal life. When the souls of the dead go down to the underworld, they are in effect eternal. So what that says is this wheel is a symbol of divine and eternal change. Again, tying in with the four-lettered name of God in Hebrew there. So there's so much going on just within the turn of the wheel. And that's before we even look at the creatures that are on the wheel. So look at the top. Sitting quite triumphantly on top of the wheel is a sphinx. So that sphinx is holding a sword. So think of that as a sword of truth. The sphinx is a symbol of wisdom. So sitting at the top of the wheel, triumphant, that's wisdom, enlightenment, empowerment. But what about on the descent? If you look to the left, you can see a snake. Now, think of these three beasts. They're all coming from Egyptian symbolism. The snake is a symbol of the god Set, the god of the underworld. So it's a descent, the god of darkness. So the snake is basically symbolizing the downturn of the wheel into darkness. But then on the other side, you have this Greco-Roman combination of the god Hermes and the god Anubis, the Hermanubis. Think of him as a guide for souls. Now, he's emerging from the darkness back up into the light. So, again, you're seeing the cyclical nature of the wheel. Everything that rises must fall, and what falls rises again. So, we see this reflected very much in the natural world. Think of the wheel also as the wheel of the year, the seasons, the progression through the signs of the zodiac. So we go from the peak of summer into the depths of winter, rebirth through spring back into summer, the gradual dying of the autumn to the dormancy of the winter, and again and again. So change, decay, rebirth, cycles. It's very powerful, isn't it? So if that appears in a reading, if it's upright, if you're looking at the positive aspect of this, when the wheel appears, think of it as the principle of the upward turn. So cycles are reaching their peak. Things are growing, improving, fulfilling. Its dark aspect, obviously, its reverse, is the downward turn of the wheel, when the powerful at the top of the wheel is toppled and falls into the darkness. So whenever this appears, you're looking at an ascent or a descent, but it reminds us this is the principle of cycles. What goes around comes around. Powerful and packed full of symbolism. So let's have a look at some of the other versions. The Crowley Thoth depicts this wheel slightly differently. You can see this is simpler. There's a 10-spoked wheel, but this is surrounded by lightning. If you look behind the wheel, there is a fire triangle, which obviously relates this card to the element of fire. You again see the Sphinx at the top of the wheel, but the creatures are slightly different. On the rise, on the left, so this wheel is turning clockwise as opposed to the anti-clockwise of the weight card. You see a baboon, I think it is. Now that symbolises unstable mental brilliance. So if you think of this creature is on the ascent, is gaining in knowledge, but that knowledge is still unstable, maybe a little bit out of control. He doesn't quite know how to apply it, whereas the Sphinx at the top represents success and stability. So that's a symbol of attainment. Now, on the right-hand side, on the descent, the creature represents mental lethargy and sluggishness. So this is a degradation, a downward turn. But interestingly, if you look in his hands, he's actually holding symbols of redemption. So it does show, once again, that what descends will, in the future, reascend, taking us back to the cyclical nature of that card. Okay, so we've looked at the Thoth and we've looked at the weight. What about the Golden Dawn? There we are, similar again, but the wheel is shown in a slightly different way again. This is a modern take on the Golden Dawn. Now, what I have to say about this one is it's actually, with this wheel card, they have augmented the symbolism of the original Golden Dawn imagery, added some of the symbolism of the weight card. So again, you can see the alchemical talismans in the centre, which wouldn't have been there in the original Golden Dawn depiction. You can also see this six-pointed Star of David with a downward water triangle and an upward fire triangle. So the polar opposite elements. So again, showing fire pointing upwards, water pointing downwards. So they wouldn't have been in the earlier Golden Dawn cards. But what this card does contain, that was in the earlier Golden Dawn elements, are the 12 multicoloured spokes. And they're clarified here because you can see that between them are the signs of the zodiac, and that's 12 divisions, 12 houses. And that's exactly what these are supposed to represent. So again, what we have here is the Wheel of the Year. So it does bring us back to cycles. You can see the Sphinx on top and the beast clinging to the bottom of the wheel. So again, peaks and troughs. Okay, so they're all variations on the theme, but if we go back to some of the very earlier cards, we see something quite different. So let's go right back to the beginning. Let's have a look at the Visconti Sforza deck. You couldn't get more different. This is literally the wheel of the goddess Fortune. So you can see in the centre of the wheel, responsible for turning it is the goddess herself, and she's blindfolded. She's blind. Now, this was not a popular goddess in medieval times. She wasn't viewed with reverence. She was very often referred to as the blind bitch. So she was, in effect, a hated and reviled figure, precisely because she turned the wheel blindly with no care for the fortunes of whoever was on it. So you can see on the left you have a human figure ascending. There's another one on top at the peak. There's a descending figure, and then there's a figure, a very downcast and downtrodden figure underneath the wheel. Now, interestingly, if you look closely at these figures, some of them have ass's ears. So there is also a sense of the vanity and foolishness of being smug when you're either ascending the wheel or at the top of it. Now, what you can't see very clearly on this reproduction is that there are speech bubbles coming from the mouths of all of these figures. Now, those speech bubbles contain Latin inscriptions. Regno, Regnavi, Sum Sine Regno, and Regnabo. So, what do they mean? And I think they're one of the most powerful things about this card. The figure at the top in Latin says, I rule. So they're fine, they're at the top of the wheel, they're riding high, their fortunes are great. The figure who's on the downward says in Latin, I have ruled, or I ruled, I used to rule. So that's less smug. Underneath the wheel in Latin, he says, I am without rule. He's right at the lowest point he can be at. And this one that is on the up says, I will rule. So there's a certain amount of vain ambition going on here, but whatever happens, it never gets past the goddess, because quite frankly, even if you're at the top of this wheel, you can't stay there forever. And that is, when you think about it, a universal principle of life. Nothing lasts forever. Even in terms of life itself, we all have a finite lifespan. Even the most successful life must come to an end and takes that downward turn. But then again, this is the wheel of life. You know, it always carries on turning, so there will always be something or someone on the up. And actually, if we think about it in shorter time frames, You know, very often when the wheel takes a downturn and we hit that rock bottom, you know, the one hope that we can cling to is even that doesn't last forever. You know, things may never be the same again, but, you know, there will always be reversals of fortune. You know, we can always jump back on the wheel and take that ride back up again, albeit in different ways. Okay, so that's the classic Wheel of Fortune in the Visconti deck. A different take in the Marseilles deck. There's no sign of the goddess on this wheel, but you actually see three beasts. We know they're beasts because they're tailed. They, you know, one looks like a dog, a couple of them look like monkeys. The one on the top, the fact that they're beasts denotes foolishness again, but just in a different way. The beast on the top is crowned and holds the sword in the similar way that we will see the Sphinx doing in the more modern cards. There is a monkey on the descent, what looks like a dog on the ascent. So again, it points to the foolishness of vanity. You know, regardless of how well things are going, we can never be complacent. We can't be vain. We are, at the end of the day, we are at the whim of change, all of us, because we are finite and we're human. And that's beautifully portrayed in this woodcut image. So what about the Swiss 1JJ? 19th century depiction. Again, we do see the goddess Fortune here. She is turning the handle of the wheel. Now, at the top of the wheel is a happy couple who look to be toasting each other. They're certainly celebrating. But if you look, there is somebody falling off that wheel into an abyss. So there is a real sense of danger. And also, again, you sense the complacency of the people on the top of the wheel. So when we think of complacency, not only do we think of vanity, as well as complacency, but also arrogance. I think the lesson of this is, if you're at the top of the wheel, actually retain your humility. You know it won't last forever, but also think of those who are less fortunate than we are. Okay, so there we have the Wheel of Fortune. In a reading, we are talking the principle of change, the fact that change is a constant in all things, in all of our life experiences. Nothing can stay the same forever. Nothing can stay in one place. The wheel of the year, the turn of the seasons, fluctuating fortunes, all of those things. Upright fortunes on the wax, reversed fortunes on the wane. Just one more card before we move away from this. One of my favourite modern depictions, very different again. This is the Robin Wood Tarot, and she cleverly portrays the wheel as a roulette wheel. You can see the metal balls spinning round as in the opposite direction as the wheel is spun. But if you look at the top of this wheel, there's a celebrating euphoric figure who's crowned with a star. Now, the ascents and the descents are denoted in different colours, and you see this figure going from happy to content to troubled to miserable to anguished at the bottom of the wheel and then back up again. So all of those cycles round the wheel are shown in terms of human emotions, which I think is a wonderful depiction. So okay, there we have it. Let's move on to card number 11, the card of justice. Now, if you cast your mind back, think back to one of our previous lessons when we talked about the card of strength in the position of card number 8. Now, in the Weight deck and in the Golden Dawn, strength and justice were transposed with each other. So as you can see here, in the Waitsmith deck, justice is indeed card number 11, as it is in the Golden Dawn deck. But obviously in the Visconti deck, these cards are unnumbered, but I presume that the tradition around the game would have followed the old ordering of the trumps. So Visconti, Marseilles, 1JJ, all of those kind of decks, you actually see justice in the position of number 8. Okay? And the Thoth deck retains that old position. So even though for our purposes we're going to be looking at this in the position of number 11, you can see that in a lot of these decks the card is swapping places with the card of strength. So let's have a look at the image. Here you can see in the Waite-Smith crowned justice on her throne, robed in red. I would say, for me, that represents power and authority. Red is a royal colour. But then there is also a cape of green, which would also tie this figure to nature to me. So there is maybe what we have here is rational and empowered law, but also natural law as well in this card. The figure of justice sits between two pillars, so this is actually quite similar to the High Priestess, but there's no duality here. The pillars are the same as each other, so this is single-minded. Now, like the High Priestess again, justice sits before a veil, but there are no gaps between the veil and the pillars here. You can't see what's beyond. The veil is purple. Now that doesn't come over perhaps quite so well in the printing of this card, but the intention is that the veil is purple. So think of purple as denoting the divine, so also this is divine justice as well. So in the right hand of justice is an upright sword, and in the left hand of justice is a set of scales. Now they're the two symbols of justice that we all know. The sword of truth and the scales to weigh and balance truth and falsity, perhaps. That's how I see it anyway. Justice is weighing the truth. So it's a fairly straightforward image. What can we say? This is the principle of justice, plain and simple. Justice is also the balance of the rational mind, the ability to weigh and discern between right and wrong. The sword enacts that. It's a sword of authority. So this figure decrees between right and wrong and enacts those decrees through the power of the sword. So upright, this is a very powerful force for good. This is the principle of honesty and fairness. It's the principle of right and correct living. It's the rule of law, the compassionate and benevolent rule of law. On a simpler level, and probably on a more primal level, this is literally the balanced mind, the balanced rationale, the ability to weigh and discern. Okay? If we reverse that figure or look at the dark aspect, we're looking at injustice, unbalance, the inability or the unwillingness to discern right from wrong, or the unwillingness to admit to being wrong. Upside down, it's the principle of injustice and tyranny. Okay? So, an interesting variation in the Golden Dawn deck. We think of justice very much as one of the virtues. So justice as a figure in herself is very much a part of our mythology. The Golden Dawn deck ties the figure of justice into the Egyptian goddess Mat, who again was the Egyptian goddess of justice. You can see that the feather of Mat actually floats in front of the goddess, and that was one of her symbols. Again, the feather sitting on the scale, so the idea was that your petitions were put on one of the scale pans, the feather of mat was put on the other, and everything had to be weighed against the feather. So let's have a look at what we've got in the pans of the scales. The scales are actually suspended from a serpent. So the serpent of wisdom, perhaps. Justice is winged in this depiction. Now, there is in one scale a skull, and in another one of the pans there is a lit candle. So darkness and light, death and life. No sword. Oh, hang on. Yes, sword in her right hand again. So actually you can see one set of scale pans actually suspended from the serpent above her head, and then in her right hand is the second set, the more literal set. So it's a beautiful, beautiful depiction, tying her in with an Egyptian goddess. That's something similar that you see in the Thoth deck. So look at this here. This is a really interesting one because this is not titled Justice, this is titled Adjustment. So rather than focusing on the classical virtue, this is the more sort of elemental, primal concept of universal balance. So in the pans of the scale, in the right pan there is the Greek letter alpha, and in the left pan there is the Greek letter omega. So alpha and omega, the first and the last letters of the alphabet, beginnings and endings. You can see the sword, but the sword is resting between her feet in a downward position. The scale pans are actually attached to her headdress. So you get the sense that the balance of adjustment, as it is here, is emanating from her rational thought. So there is a goddess aspect to this card, but if you look closely also as well, her vestments and robes are checkered with diamonds. Now this ties into the figure of the Harlequin. Now, very often you see Harlequins actually in this diamond checked outfit, but sometimes depicted in a fascinating and bewildering array of colours. There is a sense of unity in diversity, and that's what's being depicted here. A sense of order in seeming chaos is another way of looking at it. So that's the Thoth card. It's interesting, if we look back at the earlier cards, there isn't a great deal of difference. Let's look at the 1JJ. Once again, simpler. There are no pillars. There's no veil, but you do see the crowned figure of justice, and again, sword left hand, scales in the right. Okay. The Marseilles card, similar again, crown justice. Now, there's pillars, but we don't know whether these are the pillars of a throne. It's a little bit ambiguous. There could be a veil behind there, but then again, she could just be sat on the throne. And it's interesting when we look at the Visconti, because again, we have crowned justice, but above her is the figure of a knight. Now, knights are figures of social justice. So you see the cardinal virtue, but then above her you see a human figure enacting her will. So yeah, there she is, upright, the principle of rightness, fairness, honesty, justice, right living, also the balance of the rational mind. If we're looking at the more elemental side, the principle of elemental adjustment, the principle of the universe in balance, finding equilibrium. Reversed, injustice, unfairness, tyranny, all of those dark aspects. So there you have it. I hope I haven't rushed through those, and I hope that makes sense. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at card number 12, the Hanged Man, and card number 13, the infamous taboo card of the Major Arcana, the card of death. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you'll join me next time. If you've enjoyed this lesson and found it helpful, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel to find out when I share new videos or go live. You can also find me on Instagram at Chris Butler Artist, on Twitter at Butler Tarot, and on Facebook at The Sacred Tarot. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.